A very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to our debate. How can we save the planet by 2030? My name is Steve Gray, Chief Executive of Earthwatch Europe, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a fantastic evening. And thank you in advance to our speakers, who will be fielding your questions and also on social media this evening. Please feel free to follow us on Twitter and join in the debate using the hashtag #EWDebate. Just one piece of housekeeping, if I may, before we proceed. There are no planned fire alarm tests this evening. If you do hear an alarm, please make your way to the nearest exit. I'm sorry to share the news that Julia Bradbury, who was due to chair our event this evening, is unwell and has let us know that she's unable to join us. She sends her sincere apologies. However, we are extremely grateful to Lucian J. Hudson, Chair of Earthwatch Europe, for agreeing to step in at late notice. I will be introducing Lucian properly in just a moment. Before we proceed, I would like to thank the Mitsubishi Corporation Fund for Europe and Africa for supporting our events programme for over 10 years. Without your support, events like this would simply not be possible. Thank you. Now, I'm proud to lead Earthwatch Europe as Chief Executive, working with our talented team. We focus on empowering people to save the natural world. We achieve this by engaging people with critical environmental issues, such as the impacts of climate change, the declining health of our rivers and oceans, and the loss of wildlife and habitats. Tonight, our speakers will seek to convince you that their chosen environmental topic is the most important and the most feasible to resolve if we are indeed to save the planet by 2030. As many of you will also know, George Monbiot was hoping to join us here this evening, but has been undergoing treatment for prostate cancer. Whilst George has an excellent prognosis, he has had to prioritise recovering fully from recent surgery, and we announced last week that he couldn't be here with us. We wish him all the best and are delighted that Dorothée D'Herde, Director of Sustainability and Social Impact at McKinsey, will be arguing the need for action on climate change this evening. Earthwatch believes that collective action is needed to save the natural world through a combination of rigorous and relevant science and engaging experiences that inform, connect, and inspire people from many different walks of life. As such, we not only engage the public, we also engage businesses to embed sustainability into their operations, inspire the next generation by working with teachers and educators to use the outdoors as a classroom and show the value of science, and enable scientists by providing critical early career training. On this last topic, I would like to take the opportunity to thank our long-standing friend and supporter, the explorer and mountaineer Neville Schulman, CBE. Over the last 10 years, thanks to Neville's committed support, the funding provided by the Earthwatch Schulman Awards has enabled over 65 conservation researchers from Africa, Asia, Central and South America to develop their skills and expertise. Many of these researchers have gone on to become expert scientists in their own right. We are also delighted to announce that Neville has agreed to continue funding this vital programme. Thank you. Just a reminder that this is an interactive debate. You can ask questions via Twitter, as well as the questions that are taken in the room tonight. So without further ado, I am delighted to welcome to the stage your chairperson for this evening. Lucian Hudson is a strategy and communications specialist, now Director of Communications at the Open University. He was formerly the Director of Communications in 3 UK government departments, including the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and also worked in television for over 17 years with the BBC and ITV. Lucian was elected Chair of Earthwatch Europe in 2016. And Lucian, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for such a warm welcome, and welcome everyone on this very, very special evening. So we're going to get on with the discussion very, very shortly. Just where do we start when we want to save the planet? And remember, we're trying to save the planet for 2030. That's only 12 years off. One of our youngest members in the audience, our youngest participants tonight, is a 5-month-old baby. That child will only still be 12 in 2030, not even a teenager. So it's fast with us. So what are we going to do? Which areas should we focus on most of our efforts? That's the big question of this evening. In this thought-provoking public debate, and it will be thought-provoking, we have an excellent panel, and your contribution will make the difference too. The panel will consider 4 key environmental challenges. These are the 4: fresh water, the second one, climate change, the third one, wildlife, and last but by no means least, oceans. The panel will argue the hypothetical case for which environmental challenge, in their view, is the most important for halting the decline in our planet's health, and explore the potential repercussions of failing to meet the key sustainable development goals, hence the focus on 2030. The format of the event is very straightforward. First, we'll hear from each of the panel members for 2 minutes, a maximum of 2 minutes, where they pitch their arguments. After we've heard from each of the 4 panel members, we'll have an initial vote to get your views as to which of the 4 is the most important. After that, we'll hear from all of you. I'll put questions to the panel. I've had some submitted questions. We'll hear from you, and we'll hear from social media as people join us over and above the 700 here. So that's the shape of the evening, really exciting, and I'll now go through our brilliant panel. First, on freshwater, we have Tony Juniper, CBE. Tony, of course, is a living legend. He's the Executive Director for Advocacy and Campaigns at WWF. Then, on climate change, we have Dorothée D'Herde. Dorothée is a very valued colleague of mine on the board of trustees of Earthwatch. She's also the Director of Sustainability and Social Impact at McKinsey. So one of the masters of the universe. So it goes. Third, wildlife. We hear from none other than Simon King, OBE, naturalist, a wildlife filmmaker, extraordinaire in my view. And Simon will be putting the case for wildlife. And finally, we hear about oceans from Natalie Fee. Natalie is an award-winning campaigner and founder of City to Sea. Give our panel a round of applause, and I first call on Tony to speak for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Lucian. Well, it's quite obvious that if we're going to save the world by 2030, the focus has to be on the keystone issue of fresh water. Fresh water is the lifeblood of our economy. It underpins food security, it sustains our society, and indeed is the very foundation of our civilizations. Fresh water occurs on planet Earth in 3 essential forms: ice, vapor, and liquid. The ice in the polar regions help to keep our planet cool by reflecting the sun's energy back into space. Liquid water is vital for all life on land. Without it, there is no animals and plants in the terrestrial ecosystems. And vapor is essential for transporting water around the planet once it's formed into clouds. Fresh water not only sustains life, but the freshwater cycle is sustained itself by natural ecosystems. Plankton drifting in the surface of the ocean emit dimethyl sulfide, a gas that helps with cloud formation. Without that, there'd be less cloud and less rain. Tropical rainforests recycle moisture back into the atmosphere, transporting sky rivers for thousands of miles, sustaining food security very far from where the forests stand. Healthy soils help to repercolate water back into aquifers. Without healthy nature, we can't have a freshwater cycle that's secure. We all know that everything we do in terms of environmental goals is driven by human need first and foremost. If we are going to meet the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030, it will be because of political choices. The most immediately political salient issue out of the four presented this evening is fresh water. When the freshwater cycle fails, politicians act. If we're going to sustain the freshwater cycle, what the politicians have to understand, however, is that the other three priorities tonight have to be pursued as well. We have to conserve wildlife-rich forests, we have to maintain climatic stability, and we have to maintain the health of the oceans. So a focus on fresh water is the way that we achieve all four. Thank you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased and grateful to be here this evening. Our climate is changing. 2017 was the hottest year on record. Before that, it was 2016. Before then, you guess it. Nearly half of the hottest years recorded since 1850 have occurred in this century. So man-made climate is a reality. Carbon pollution is warming our planet. Sea levels are rising. Hotter air absorbs more water, and more moisture in the atmosphere creates more extreme weather events. Natural disasters triggered by climate change have doubled in frequency since the 1980s. Droughts, floods, hurricanes, wildfires. We're all paying the price for global warming in our lives and livelihoods. And tragically, it's the poor people who are affected most badly. So if you care about health, climate change matters. If you care about poverty, climate change matters. If you care about people getting displaced, climate change matters. If you care about feeding 9 billion people, about freshwater, wildlife, oceans, climate change matters. With our current path of year-on-year emissions increases, major cities will drown, species will have to migrate, and our children will be fleeing from vicious storms. So climate change is the biggest environmental risk we face. 1,000 experts who were surveyed for the latest World Economic Forum Global Risk Report ranked extreme weather events as the most likely risk and the second most impactful, just after weapons of mass destruction. So climate change is either a cause or an exacerbator of so many of the other threats we face. It changes everything. Oh, poor baby. But we can solve this, we have to. So to echo President Macron's words at the US Congress, there is no planet B. But we also need to stop kidding ourselves. The climate crisis is already here. It's not for the end of the century, it's not for our grandchildren, it's for us and our children. So how to get there? 1, get on board with a new industrial revolution with renewables, decarbonized transport, battery storage, new materials like graphene, etc. 2, tackle land use and deforestation. Forests and agriculture are a third of the solution. 3, build resilience and invest in climate repair. 4, educate girls. 5, change the narrative, make it an innovation agenda and opportunity. And 6, change our beliefs, change our paradigms, our behaviors. So to end, I want to bring George Monbiot into the conversation. In Heat, he writes that the campaign against climate change is a campaign not just against others, but against ourselves. So are you ready to be the change and tackle our biggest challenge and to create a climate for change? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to be here this evening. I'm just going to kick off by saying we don't have to save the planet because the planet's quite good at looking after itself. Always has been. But if we do want to have a part to play in its future, then we've got to pick up our game a little bit. And I would like to argue, someone's hidden the clicker. Where did you put it? You did? It's fallen in there. I'd like to argue that, there we go. Time's up, job's done. Now, I'd just like to argue that there is no more tangible example of change than the creatures and the plants that live on planet Earth. There is no greater measure of how healthy an ecosystem is than the biodiversity and the biomass in any one biome. And we only have to look across the planet as a whole to see how impoverished it has become in such an incredibly short space of time as a direct consequence of our actions. All of the charismatic megafauna of the planet, with very few exceptions, has been squeezed to the tiny margins of wilderness that we still allow it to exist in, and even there, it's heavily persecuted, whether it be elephant and rhino, whether it be the great predators. All of these have been pushed to the very margins of existence as a result of our actions. And we don't even have to look towards those wilderness areas that for some of us seem remote and exotic. We can look to the poles, indeed, where apparently human interference is minimal. And yet still even there, when we go to Antarctica or we go to the Arctic, we see impoverished life as a consequence of our actions. And yes, every one of the campaigns and indeed the points that are being raised this evening, whether it be climate change, ocean, freshwater, all of these affect life. But I would argue that it is in looking to those ambassadors, those creatures that captivate us and grab our attention, that we can actively make a difference. And we can see very quickly if we're making a positive change. And we haven't got to look overseas. Even here in the British Isles, you know, we're lucky to be blessed with a rich fauna. But how impoverished and how much of a shadow is that fauna now, today, compared to even 200 years ago? It is a shadow of what it once was, but it is in our gift to make a real difference to everything that lives here and beyond. Today, this is called unimproved grassland. That is called grassland that has been improved. I would argue the exact opposite. It is not what you see, it's how you see it. And just to quote Anne Nin, we do tend to look at things the way we want them to be, even though intelligently we can see what they should be. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening. So 4 years ago, I wouldn't have considered myself an environmental campaigner. I knew about climate change and the major environmental issues we were facing, but really I did little more than switch energy supplier and put my recycling out. Then one day I came across the trailer for the heartbreaking and fantastic film called Albatross by the artist Chris Jordan, and that changed my life. I knew that I couldn't stand by and do nothing while these majestic, beautiful birds died in their nests with their bellies full of plastic. And we currently have a really wonderful opportunity, quite literally in our hands. Plastic is the brightest, most garish calling card that's currently laying on every beach and riverbank around the world. It's impossible to miss. It can be seen and touched from our local rivers to the most remote and deepest parts of our oceans, and its effect is undeniable. It's the most popular and most talked about environmental issue of our time, and we need to grab our boards and ride this wave. I believe plastic pollution holds right now the most exciting solution to the wider environmental crises we face. It's a new wave of hundreds of thousands of budding environmentalists. People who, until the recent surge in media interest, hadn't made the connections between our actions and our oceans. And they didn't know that if they flushed plastic down the loo, that could also end up in our seas. These people, newly awake to environmental issues, have also seen a change come about in a matter of months, showing them that when we unite on a cause as individuals, as petition signers, our media, that our supermarkets, our retailers, and our government listen and act. So I think a vote for the ocean right now is a tactical vote through the easy to access and understand issue of plastic pollution. We've reached the mainstream, and in many cases we have access to their inboxes and social media feeds. So I think we should harness the power of the zeitgeist and gently, creatively and playfully move the conversation on from the plastic they hold in their hands to the power we have as environmental campaigners. Who knows, in 4 years' time, they could end up standing here on stage at the RGS alongside some of the greatest environmentalists of our time. Something I never dreamt would be possible. Thank you.
A wonderful start. Thank you very much, panelists. Now, just before we get into the questions and answers, I think it might be useful just to take a show of hands on what, at this stage, you see as the most important challenge. Now, I know we probably all argue that everything's important, but we have to prioritise, including yourselves. So I'm going to go through each of those environmental challenges and ask you to show your hands once, and once only, for what you see as the biggest environmental challenge. So on fresh water, who here thinks that's the biggest environmental challenge? Fair number, thank you very much. Tackling climate change. Ooh, all right. So quite a few there. Wildlife. Quite a few, okay. And finally, oceans. All right, okay. So Dorothée, you've got to hold that ground between now and the end of the evening. No pressure, eh? No pressure. All right, let's just tackle that climate change. People voted there, a lot of people voted on tackling climate change. I mean, this is really a question for the whole panel, but I mean, you know, Dorothée's made her pitch. Isn't it true that climate change cuts across everything, and shouldn't we get that sorted in order to make real progress?
Yes. So all of these four things, as we've just seen from the initial presentations, they're all linked. And so any one of them is intricately connected with all of the others. But it depends how you want to see the process of change going forward. As I said just a moment ago, in the end, the human reaction to this ecological crisis, which is now upon us, is going to be mediated via politics. And politics is a tricky place to get things done. So Donald Trump's rejection of the Paris Agreement is one example of how climate change sometimes stumbles in to political controversy and therefore action slows down. Work on the oceans, with the exception of plastic, it seems quite far away. It's out of sight and out of mind. People tend to be more concerned about what's affecting them. Wildlife, we're all very concerned about the disappearance of species, but people, again, think it doesn't really affect them. Food prices, energy shortages, people having to go into the streets to get water, that's the kind of thing that is a real political crisis and which will galvanise the kind of action that we need and do it in a way which will affect all of the others positively. Because if you want to have secure water supply into the future, you've got to be climate resilient. If we want to have secure water in the future, we've got to have a healthy ocean, because those plankton which are seeding the clouds, if the ocean becomes acidic, they may die off. And of course, if we want to have rainforests pumping moisture into the atmosphere, they have to stay standing. It's the most wildlife-rich habitat on the face of the earth. So I'm kind of brought back to the politics of this in answering that question. Climate change is pervasive. The mass extinction is pervasive. The decline of the oceans is terrifying. But the thing that will get the politicians lined up to take action is what's going to affect the voters, and that's water supply.
All right, Tony. Oh, got some applause there. Still on oceans then, Natalie.
When I talk. Okay.
Natalie, why can't you just throw your lot in with Dorothée on climate change? Why don't you just support climate change? Why push your corner on the oceans?
Of course I do, but I think I alluded to it in my 2-minute pitch, in that there are still some people that don't connect with climate change. And I think that is the problem with it, is that it seems too big to tackle. It's like, it's too overwhelming, and it's really scary. And I think why I'm the advocate of plastic pollution and starting small. I mean, it's not a small problem, but it's something that we are literally dealing with like hundreds of times a day. We have that choice as consumers to make that choice, whereas with climate change, it's the big choices like, who do I get my energy from, what transport do I take, who do I bank with, those kind of things. But actually, this is like every time they get their wallet out, they're likely to come into contact with plastic. So I think it's tangible, and I think that's why people are getting on board with it, because it's something they can understand.
Simon, you made your pitch saying, why save the planet? And obviously a big show of hands there in favour of tackling climate change. How do you respond to why climate change ought not to be so much of a priority compared to what you're arguing for on wildlife?
The point's been made already, and I'll make it again, that every single one of the champions that we are supporting here has a net effect on everything else. Climate change will, of course, affect every living thing, potentially. And I'd just like to add that there's a tiny but vociferous and dangerous voice out there that draws on the fact that the planet has changed historically. And of course it has, we know it has. We've gone through ice ages, we've gone through warmer periods. What we haven't done, and we've never seen, is the unprecedented speed of change that we're currently seeing. But what I would say is that whilst addressing climate change is crucial, the only way we will see a profound difference is by the levels of life generally supported by the biomes of the planet as a whole, and that's wildlife. We can't see what's happening unless we see how things either improve, stabilize, or degrade. And the most tangible example of that are the very things, including ourselves. Let's not separate ourselves from the environment. The bedrock of our survival. We're an animal too. The bedrock of our survival depends on a healthy environment, and it is using that shift. We work from a shifting baseline the whole time. When I was a kid, I didn't think twice about seeing and hearing lapwing out on the Somerset levels breeding. Now it's a rarity. Many of you probably haven't heard a cuckoo this spring. Now that is tragic. I can. There we are. Shall I do another one? The fact you haven't heard a cuckoo you might think is insignificant. The net effect of cuckoos not breeding in this country is much more profound than just for the cuckoo and the intrinsic value of that bird. It is the effect that we have had on the land that has affected that bird's food source, that has affected its ability to breed as a consequence, and indeed the birds that it parasitizes in terms of nesting. We don't know how that will affect our survival yet, but I'm guessing it's not good. So if we don't use the natural world as our temper, as our measure, what do we look to?
Okay. All right, audience. Yes, Simon's recovering some ground here, Dorothée. So how do you come back to that point?
No. I might give him a punch. The fact that climate change is the hardest issue, which indeed it is, doesn't mean it's not the greatest, and doesn't mean it's not feasible to solve it, despite politics and despite what people do in their day-to-day behaviors. Think of the power of investors, the power of business, the huge opportunity for innovation, for disruption, for a fourth industrial revolution, to reach the potential to curb climate change with opportunities. And seize those opportunities. So the Better Growth, Better Climate report by the Commission for Business and the Environment lays out a set of 10 things, very concrete things, that if we do them by 2030, we can get 96% on our way to curbing climate change. So it is feasible. It is hard, but it is feasible.
Can I just ask a further question, Dorothée? That's all very well, but the world seems to have adapted in the past. If we lose a species, we lose a species. You know, and we're seeing that left, right, and centre at the moment. It's very dispiriting. Why can't the world just adapt? I mean, why make so much more of climate change when we could do something as specific as, you know, tackle oceans, tackle wildlife, tackle fresh water?
Well, we will have to adapt. That's for sure. We're already kind of too far down the line, especially, for example, with ocean warming, etc., to go back to what it used to be. But do we want to accept that? This is human ingenuity. You know, we have a responsibility to do something about this. It's also the case that obviously in what happened for decades and eras before the 20th century is very different from what's happening now, where suddenly the CO2 levels have skyrocketed because of man-made climate change. So we're not in the same trend as before where we adapt, etc. It's gone like this, and then woof.
Okay.
That's where responsibility comes
Does
in.
any member of the panel want to come back on any of those points?
Not to contradict it.
Okay, nicely done, Dorothée. Can I just go back on a point that I think I think you made, Natalie, really well. We can look at what action to take, what priorities we have to take, through the lens of impact and the lens of feasibility. You spoke about feasibility. What actually can we do? So what, in terms of impact, feasibility, what were the panels saying? I mean, why is what you're saying for your environmental challenge the area that we should most focus on? Perhaps not less so on impact, more in terms of feasibility, what we can actually do between now and 2030. Because at the end of the day, this evening is about taking practical action, isn't it? Tony?
So some of the things I've seen in recent years inspire me to think that actually quite a lot of what we need to do to conserve wildlife and to fight climate change in particular, we can do by motivating action through fresh water. Two very quick examples. Some of the things I've seen in the southwest of England with a water company working with the wildlife trusts to restore wildlife-rich habitat on the hills in Dartmoor and Exmoor in order to secure a more secure and cleaner supply of water running off of the hills in order to pipe that most cost-effectively to consumers. The water company has seen an economic case for conserving and restoring a natural habitat which is blanket bog, absolutely full of carbon. So a massive carbon benefit and a wildlife benefit motivated by fresh water, millions of pounds being spent to restore that habitat. In West Africa, 2 years ago, in research for a recent piece I wrote about the tropical rainforests, I saw chocolate companies in areas of depleted tropical rainforest trying to save the tropical rainforest in order to maintain the water supply in the form of rain that was watering the cocoa fields. As the rainforest has been depleted, there's been more droughts. Big money going into conserving the tropical rainforest, which is full of carbon. Tool-using chimpanzees, zebra duikers, forest elephants being conserved in the process, but because of the fresh water and the carbon benefit alongside that. So I do think there's a great deal that can be done if we can motivate people in the right way, and the business case around fresh water is extremely powerful, both to governments and also to private sector companies.
That's a good one on feasibility. Do you want to come back on feasibility yourself, Natalie?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I'm certainly not for a moment saying plastic is the biggest problem that we're facing, but it's feasible to switch all these hundreds of thousands of people on to taking more steps. And that's something that I'm personally really, really excited about at City to See. We've gone from a mailing list of 0 to 35,000 people that are opening our emails. And they're people that we can take on a journey, and we can switch them on to climate change and through plastic pollution. Like, so do you know that your money is actually funding the oil business? It's funding fracking, you know, and then we can switch them on to switching who they bank with and who their energy supplier is. So I just think that it's like a little stealth mode that we need to kind of seize that opportunity. So I think in terms of, is it feasible? I don't know whether it's feasible to get all the plastic out of the ocean, but it's certainly feasible to create a new wave of interest and people that feel connected to their environment.
What do you want to come back on feasibility, Simon? What's feasible?
I'd like to use, the phrase you used was a lens. And I'd like to shift the lens away from what sometimes feels intangible. When we talk of corporate and business-led initiatives, indeed initiatives led by governments, sometimes it feels like it's out of our grip. We can all make differences to the way we live, and we all make changes, and in so doing, we affect those corporations, and we frankly affect our governments in a democracy, because we're the voters. And it's up to us, we mustn't pass the buck, to look at how we live, how we choose to spend our money and our time, and going forward, that of course will affect everything, your own backyard, the oceans, the fresh water, the climate as a whole, and fundamentally, life. And when, you know, wildlife is a cuddly word for the very life support system upon which each and every one of us depend. There are lots of us, and that's a point that we haven't tackled. Maybe we should have had that as a heading as well, the population of humanity on Earth. And curbing that, or at least stemming its growth, might be something we want to consider. But even having said that, we currently produce sufficient food, apparently, on this planet to feed over 10 billion people, and we've only got 7.5 billion, of which a tremendous amount of that food is wasted. A lot of it is fed to other organisms that we then eat, i.e. animals. So we have to think about how we spend our pound to ensure a sustainable future, not just for ourselves, but for every other living thing. And as a champion of wildlife, every other living thing matters because, as I mentioned earlier, it's the bedrock of our own survival.
I've got a handful of questions here that have come in earlier from people participating, and obviously I'll come to the audience and hear from social media in a moment. But can I just ask a question of the panel about the public and its role? I mean, obviously Earthwatch believes in science and public engagement of that science. You know, what is it that the public can do? And I know all of you have got very strong and clear views on that. Can I start with you, Tony?
The public are, in the end, the people who determine everything. As Simon says, you know, we all go shopping, so I'll be paying attention to who we're shopping from and what kind of policies and activities that they champion. And some companies in the same sector, whether it's retail or consumer goods, some of them are very good and have got this, and others really haven't done. And people can find out about that and they can act upon that when they go shopping. So that is extremely powerful, and certainly some of the companies I've worked with, the thing that they're terrified of is the consumers turning against them. So we've all got immense latent power if we choose to use it. And then, of course, the other thing that we do is we vote. And in democracies, we can decide where we're going to put our X based upon the kind of issues we're talking about this evening. I tell you, one very big thing that's happened in British politics lately is the roar coming from the under-30s. It was evident in the last general election, and some of us, you know, you may see the current government talking about the environment in a surprisingly good way during recent months. Why is that? Well, they did some polling to discover that the thing they've got to do to win the next election is to appeal to young people. What are young people most concerned about? The future of the oceans, wildlife, climate change, sustainability. And so that power is now out there. And actually, anybody active on social media, I was saying this to Natalie earlier on, there's a huge opportunity now for mobilizing young people to make a massive impact on politics. So the power is with us, as shoppers and voters in particular, but also as conveyors of information, as leaders in terms of how we live. Do we avoid plastic? Do we eat less meat? Do we do our recycling? Do we try and source organic food? All of those things, other people watch what other people do. And human society, in the end, is cultural. We tend to follow the mainstream. And the more of us who live like there is a problem on planet Earth, the more other people will follow that behaviour. You see it all the time. It's called fashion. And actually what we need now is the embedding of sustainability really as something which hits the culture like fashion does.
Tony made a really strong point there about this enormous latent power, Dorothée. You've worked closely with government, with business. What have you noticed over time that you think means that business itself takes more seriously the consumer or the public more generally?
There's this politics, people, business. I come from McKinsey, what else should I represent, right? Yes, business is taking this more seriously. And, you know, we are consumers, we are voters, but we're also employees. And that's where we can all show what we want by working for the right companies. You know, Unilever is one of the top-rated companies and is attracting a huge amount of the best talent just by having such an amazing vision on sustainable planet. So business, what can business do specifically on climate change? Set science-based targets. So set targets to reduce their emissions that are in line with the reductions that we need to meet the Paris targets. And that's very powerful. Over 400 companies have already done it. You know, investors will start to look at that. That can be like a whole movement. Companies can really move the needle on this. You know, a company like Unilever has 2 billion people every day using Unilever products. Unilever has thousands of suppliers, so if they do something and put things in place, they can really move the needle in a bigger way, unfortunately, than we all can together. But we can work through those companies.
One question that's come in is actually how can we persuade the public and politicians and business of the economic benefits of protecting our environment? So what's the economic case to be made? Don't I have to go at this, Simon?
Yes, of course. There's a tremendous economic case to be made for, I'll use the word wildlife, but for a thriving biome. Because as Tony referred earlier to the Upstream Thinking Initiative in the southwest of England, which happens to involve fresh water, and I wholly support that initiative. But there are many wonderful initiatives that do precisely the same thing in the ocean and do precisely the same thing trying to curb and address our CO2 emissions, all of which result in a healthy biome, a healthy community of living things. There's a beautiful example, and I think, in fact, Tony, you drew on this in one of your brilliant books, What Has Nature Ever Done for Us, where vultures in India were dying as a consequence of having eaten cattle which had been dipped in a certain pesticide to get rid of ticks, etc. But the vultures were dying. So what? So there's a few less stinky birds around. What happened as a direct consequence of that was that human beings started dying of rabies much more. Why? Because carcasses were on the ground that were not then being eaten by vultures, which were then being eaten by feral dogs, which as a consequence got together. Rabies started to ravage the population, and we saw this cascade of chaos occurring as a direct consequence of something that we could never possibly have predicted. Well, actually, I'll qualify that, because one of the things that we have, you'd question it with some individuals, is some grey matter. And the truth is, I'll come back to that phrase. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are, as the way we want them. We convince, I'm convinced that some of the time we work with two brains. The one brain that's common sense and understands the consequence of our actions, and the other that is a hedonistic, I really do want a bacon sandwich. So, and we've all got those two brains. What we have to do is let the intelligent, informed bit of ourselves govern our actions. That's what we all, and each and every one of us, has to do. And whilst, of course, if one great corporate shows brilliant initiatives in the circular economy, in working towards a sustainable future, brilliant. But that corporate phenomenon is made up of people. It's made up of you and I. It's us. And I come back to that simple decision that you can make with, you're a steward, each and every one of you. I don't know if it's a window box, if it's a square meter or more of ground, but you're a steward of something. You're a steward of walking out of your front door into the supermarket and making a decision. Hopefully it's not a supermarket. Maybe it's the local shop. Maybe it's the local greengrocer. Maybe it's the allotment, and you actually grow your own leeks. Bravo. Because that's what will make the difference going forward, is a paradigm shift in the way we take responsibility for the consequence of our actions, and as a consequence, the sustainable future of the very beautiful blue rock that we all depend upon.
Eloquently put. Natalie, where do you see the balance of responsibility between the public, business, politicians? You know, who should do what to take forward, particularly your agenda?
Yeah, I think it obviously comes from all angles. I mean, to pick up on the Unilever thing, I mean, they're doing okay, but they're not doing that great. I mean, it's like 25% recycled plastics by 2025. It's not that impressive, you know, when you think of what they could be doing. So I think, like, the role is very much there for us to motivate and lead as individuals. But they're opening up their doors, and sort of people like me can go in and give talks and talk to and inspire individuals that are in there as well. But I think, like, what we're seeing happening with, say, for example, the cotton buds that are now made of paper instead of plastic, as a result of consumers asking for that change, the deposit scheme that's coming in, as a result of individuals signing petitions and lobbying the government. So I think, like, that's the most exciting part for me, is really seeing those changes coming in now. That all of us, all of you, I'm sure, how many of you have recently signed a petition on plastic pollution in the UK? Yeah, it's good. Yeah, like more than half the room.
Yeah.
And you're making those changes, and that for me is just like, that's where the joy is.
Speaking of which, the joy is also in the audience, and I'm sure a lot of questions in the audience too. And obviously I'll come back to some more that have come in, as well as social media. So this is your opportunity to put questions. A forest of hands already coming up. Please try and keep your questions brief. Say who you are and where you're from if you wish. And then, of course, we'll put it to the panel. So, yes, you were quite quick off the mark over there. I'll try and take as many as possible. Gentleman with the hat or the beret, or yes, that's the one. Mike is coming towards you.
Thank you very much for this talk this evening. It's been very good. I think the Royal this association is, you just said, was funded by Mitsubishi, which is a weapons industry, which is an oil company, which is a car company, and one of the sole reasons why we have global disaster as we do today. Not the only one, but one of the sole reasons. And yet, this institution takes money for the last, as the opening bloke said, has taken money for the last 10 years. Will this institution apologise to the people, or each trust member and the board, apologise for taking that money, handing that, and then hand all that money back, and then reassess themselves? And the title, and then the panel said that, are you ready to be that change? This society needs to live to that. Are you ready to be that change?
Okay.
Thank you.
All challenges accepted. Can we get the mic to Steve Gray? Some more coming up, yeah. Just answer that particular point.
Thank you very much. A very important question.
Yeah, and we'll come to the panel too.
I'm the opening bloke, so I'll be very keen to respond. One clarification, it's not the RGS, it is Earthwatch who receives money from the Mitsubishi Corporation Fund for Europe and Africa, and we've always been transparent about that, and indeed the other businesses that we partner with. It would be a very long decision as to why we've made a careful and thoughtful choice to engage with businesses, recognising the significant impact that their activities do have on the environment and the issues. Well, we believe that actually working together is the way to generate the change that we're talking about tonight. I don't necessarily expect in a short response to get you to agree with my position, but that is our position as an organisation. It is a position shared by many of the most successful and impactful environmental NGOs in this country. And the whole theme of our debate here between all of these issues is that if we don't all collectively act, we won't make change. Businesses can make change. We can be a critical and very constructive friend to business, and that is the approach that we take. So I just wanted to make that response. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Got a forest of hands. Yes, the woman just over there. Could you get the mic? Quite a lot of questions, so let's get the mic through.
Hi, I'm from Brazil, and I worked for many years in the farm industry. Livestock and sugarcane. And during those years, I witnessed what happens behind the curtains in terms of corruption, all kind of agreements between the government, the farmers, the industry. And even though hearing everything that you said about being possible to make a change, I find very unlikely that that would happen where it must happen, that's to save the Amazon forest. And I understand that individually we can help as consumers, but I don't see that happen on time because it's very hard to put pressure in a family business that owns a farm, that to go from one side to another I need to take an airplane, and they literally do everything they want. So I saw farmers destroying entire rivers just to put sugarcane on. And I would like to understand how from Europe we can in fact affect the developing countries and fight against the corruption, because we will never take motivation from these people. They don't care. How do you do something taking all of that in consideration?
Okay, Tony, do you want to come back on that?
So you've touched on a question which runs across everything we've talked about this evening. I'd describe it as the question of governance and the extent to which public institutions and businesses are trustworthy and operating by the rules and are not subject to corruption or to bad practice that's going unreported. And across the world, this is a problem, and it is more pronounced in some places than others. And it seems at the moment that Brazil is suffering from an increase in that kind of difficulty. There was a period between 2006 and 2012 when the deforestation rate in the Amazon declined by 80%. And this appears to be a period when the government was quite actively clamping down, enforcing the environmental code, and now evidently things have shifted again. So how do we achieve good governance to make sure that public institutions are obeying the law and following the codes that have been established through parliaments and what have you? And so 3 or 4 things that I've seen that work over the years. So one thing is pressure through supply chains. So people in Europe are buying soya beans that are coming from areas in Brazil. They're buying beef and leather, sugarcane, and some companies who are buying that are trying to work down the supply chain to check on legality at least, even if it's not necessarily totally sustainable. That has made a big impact. The soya moratorium from 2006, this was a Greenpeace campaign. It was a brilliant campaign, exposing the links between deforestation in Mato Grosso through to McDonald's restaurants in the UK. They targeted McDonald's, there was a shockwave went down the supply chain, and the deforestation from soya stopped, even with the corruption on the ground. So that's one route. Another route is via bilateral relations between countries. I believe the Norwegian government that was funding action in the Amazon has now withdrawn some of its funding because there's no longer reliable governance in some areas. And the other way of doing this, of course, is through multilateral bodies like the World Bank and the IMF, who can withdraw support when governance is not good. And so this is a terrible, corrosive problem that causes environmental damage, it causes poverty, and obviously it just erodes the trust that people have in public institutions. And so it is possibly the biggest issue of all, actually, lying behind all these things we've talked about tonight. Waste management of plastic in developing countries, corruption in the waste management industry, they chuck it in the sea, wildlife, obviously, elephant ivory being taken out with bribes given to border guards, climate change, people trading CFCs illegally across boundaries for air conditioning systems that are out of date, it escapes into the atmosphere, all examples of corruption and illegal activity, and we have to clamp down on that, which is why we need strong government and trustworthy government right across the piece to do all of this, which again brings us back to the role of the voter and the extent to which people in any kind of democracy allow people to get away with that.
Sparked a very good question there. Anything else from other members of the panel on governance, trust?
What can one add after that?
I think that's a comprehensive response. I also think, however, I'm sorry, I'm going to sound a bit like a stuck record, but if you don't eat beef that's been fed on soya, you don't have the deforestation in the first place. So,
I actually just wanted to pick up on the question that was asked before, actually, because it's a question that's really close to my heart at the moment, so I'm grateful that you raised it. In the past week, and I actually put this on Facebook to kind of poll my friends, in the past week I was asked to go and give a talk at EDF and Pfizer, and for me, my kind of big sort of three no-nos have been oil, big pharma, and the arms trade, and so sort of two in a week, and then I hadn't made the connection for tonight. But actually, you know, it was really interesting, the process that I went through, and as an organisation leading my company, of what do we do in this situation? And really for me, it was about, actually at the end of the day, it was about just following my heart and what felt right to me to do in that moment. And to go in and to talk to employees, like you say, you know, the people that make up these companies, to talk about plastic pollution, but then also to raise the other concerns that I have while I'm there, and have a dialogue, have an open-hearted dialogue with the people in the room. And I think that, for me, was the decision that I came to, although as an organisation we decided not to partner with EDF, but that I would go in there and talk with the employees, and get paid to go in there and talk to the employees. So thanks for raising that.
Okay, well answered. Any other questions? Yes, quite a few. Yes, and at the back too, so I won't forget those. You, sir, and then we'll take a couple of questions there and a couple at the back. So you first, please.
Can I just expand on what Simon says? I work in a company of 40 people, and the only thing that made them sit up and notice was, have you cleaned any insects off your windscreen in the last 2 years? Did we as a country miss that very, very visible point from people who drive X5s down to Austin A40s? The fact a large chunk of the food chain is missing for some reason.
Okay.
Did we miss that point?
it's a point, thank you for, sorry to just jump in, thank you for that point, and it's a point that has been raised many times, in fact. The catastrophic decline in invertebrate life in the UK and Western Europe and indeed the Americas as a whole, not just as a consequence of direct persecution through insecticides, but also, more importantly, through habitat loss. and the degradation of habitat as a whole. And you're absolutely right. It's a terribly clear, tangible result. We all probably, or many of us, some of you too young, would have been experienced in driving to and fro across the UK, and every journey was accompanied by splat, and a great deal of splat on the windscreen. It was the only thing that concerned them. Which is why, of course, my cause is champion, because it's the way you communicate. Exactly. I'm only going to hold wildlife up as a flag. Of course, everything else is the foundation of supporting life and wildlife. But to penetrate sometimes a psyche that is otherwise blind. And let's be honest, you know, this is a terribly wonderful suburban middle-class attitude to look at life and appreciate it. I was chatting with Steve earlier about kids visiting, was it Sherwood Forest or a woodland nearby, and one of the kids who was 10 or 11 that Steve encountered, it was the first time he'd ever been in a woodland in 10 years of living, and was scared that there might be bears and wolves. That's the level of disconnect here in the UK. Goodness knows what it's like elsewhere in urban populations. So in showing human beings, not just the intrinsic value of life as a whole, but the very fact that the Junior Oxford Dictionary has eradicated words like bramble and kingfisher and stickleback in favour of words like blog is just tragic, utterly tragic. We are allowing the degradation to take place under our very noses. And I say we, it's not them, it's us. And we can all stand up and make a difference. We can all make change.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Yeah, let's take a couple more questions there. Yes, you're ready with your mic there.
Hi, so I just wanted to say first, I put my hand up for climate change, but I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate here, which is that maybe a response from Dorothée, that climate change really hides, the climate change narrative hides underlying environmental challenges, that when you mentioned the report, Better Growth, Better Climate, that really we're not managing to decouple growth and environmental impact. And even if we decouple growth and emissions, we manage the carbon dioxide and the greenhouse gas emissions issue, that we have all these other ones which are not at all addressed by the climate change and which can't be addressed if we continue looking at only growth. For example, the impact of solar cells or of lithium-ion batteries, which really is quite a huge negative environmental impact on the Earth, which isn't at all tackled by this narrative, which is perpetuated by business, by the looking at growth as the overarching goal, and that perhaps through issues like wildlife, like freshwater, which are more tangible, we're able to have a more encompassing view of how to actually live in the ecosystem Earth, inside planetary boundaries. So the summary is that, does climate change narrative hide other impacts and other environmental challenges?
Okay, good question. Devil's advocate question. Dorothée, do you want to come back on that? Since you were in the lead earlier, you should be put on the spot now.
Oh, God. Yes, the answer is yes, we're hiding something. No. You know, all of these issues are really important, but there's also kind of the reality of the world growing, right? And unless we buck the trend on consumerism and we start educating girls to limit the population growth, because that's why I mentioned educate girls. It was one of the kind of top 10 ways in which we can curb climate change is, you know, by educating girls, because there's a direct link between fertility and the level of education of girls. So yes, there are many underlying issues that in a, you know, obviously in a 2-minute pitch are not dug into, but I think there is more and more an acknowledgement of all of those things. And most companies, you know, kind of see their sustainability strategy with the 3 pillars of, you know, enough for all forever in a way. So the social, the environmental, the governance aspects come into that. And it's a complicated debate, obviously. But thank you for your point.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions coming in through social media, so I want to hear from those very shortly. But there were some questions at the back. Yes, so you've been very patient at the back. Yeah, they are the one. Let's get the mic over right to the very back. We don't discriminate against people at the very, very back here.
Thank you very much. We've heard a great deal about how politics is going to be key in making some action here, and how the youth movement is going to spark some energy, and we've obviously got a bit of a plastic enthusiasm at the moment. But we've also heard about how these are global problems and we need to take those actions overseas, and the Brazilian was a very good case in point. So for each of the areas, really, to help us determine which is the most important, to all the panellists, do you see, to what extent and in what sort of areas do you see possibility for the UK government to stand up and demonstrate leadership, to really take actions so we can scale up around the rest of the world? Where might that be possible?
Great question.
Very good. Just kind of jumping in. So the UK leading on the global stage, this is really, really important because we've already seen a glimpse of this following the adoption of the Climate Change Act in 2008, which I think was actually quite material in enabling the Paris Agreement to be reached, because we had at least one country that had adopted a national plan based on law which was going in the right direction. And actually, talking at this point a second ago about economic growth and climate change, the UK is one of the few countries that has grown its economy whilst cutting its emissions over recent years. There's a lot of complexity behind that, but we are doing it, and part of it is about the technology revolution that Dorothée mentioned. And so, you know, it is possible to go in that route, and by doing that, other countries then think, actually, it is possible to do this. You can have a high quality of life and reduce the environmental impact. So looking forward, the thing I would say, and at WWF we're very much of the view that this needs to happen next, is we need to see the UK stepping up on the global wildlife issue and to be leading in a similar way as it did on climate change, but on the recovery of natural systems and the natural environment. And so yesterday we had a report, a consultation published by the Department for the Environment. It's very weak. We'll be campaigning to try and strengthen that, to make this the kind of post-Brexit leadership that we can take onto the global stage in the next couple of years, because we're going to have a Paris-style moment on nature in 2020 in the form of a biodiversity convention meeting, and we're going to be pressing the British government to show leadership there, as the French government did in Paris in 2015, because the mass extinction that's now upon us can't be solved by any single country. It's going to require global leadership. We're arguing that if we start to recover our natural environment here, we will have some credentials to take onto the global stage. And so that's the campaign right now.
Okay, very good. Do you want to pick up that challenge?
Sure. Yeah, good question. I mean, I think, and I didn't think I would find myself saying this, but our current government is actually starting to lead the way around the world when it comes to plastic. So we need to make sure that they expand that into other areas in terms of oceans and environmental issues as well. But you know, just leading on the deposit scheme, talking about banning straws and other sort of potential bans coming in and levies. My sort of counterparts around Europe at the moment are like literally get in touch with me and like, what the hell is going on in the UK at the moment? Like change is happening sort of every week, and your retailers as well as your government. So I think, you know, it's a really good time for us sort of showing the way at the moment. And beyond Europe as well, people are starting to look at what's happening here in the UK.
Yeah. Thanks, Natalie. Simon.
Yes, excellent question. I'd like to question the principle of growth. I'm not a massive advocate of it. I know that it becomes a mantra that we all listen to and think has to happen. And we say, oh, good, we're a nation in growth. And then we hear the word recession as though it's the bogeyman hiding under the bed. Recession means we're using less. And I think in order for there to be a paradigm shift, we have to think about what we value. And is value represented by the latest gadget and how many things you've got, as I've seen on bumper stickers in the States, actually. Or, there's probably some here, or is it about the quality of life and the legacy you leave, the footprint that you have made? I think it's the latter. I do not think you have succeeded by the stuff you've got. I think you succeed in your legacy and the way that you live and the way that you've impacted. And if you take out as less than you used as you pop your mortal coil, good for you. So as far as I'm concerned, the mantra of growth is not something I particularly adhere to, and I think we need to question that alongside all of the very valuable rhetoric of supporting green policy.
Do you want to say? You're certainly scoring points on the decibel counter, Simon. It'll be very interesting to see how the votes turn out, however. Dorothée.
Yes, I just wanted to add on to that. There's another paradigm shift that we can talk about, which is not about using less, but using differently and thinking less linearly and more circularly. So rather than taking, making, and disposing, we make sure that we close the loops, and the end of the life of one product becomes the beginning of a life of another one, and there is value, gold in the garbage, and value in kind of designing for reuse and all of those things. So that's another big paradigm shift that we need that can address some of that, consumerism, growth, etc., by doing it in a different way with different paradigm.
There are a couple more questions I could take at the back, but before I do that, just want to hear from Sarah, who's our social media overseer, the voice, a disembodied voice. Sarah.
Good evening, Lucian.
Now, Sarah, you are out there in the ether on social media. Just let us know how this debate is going across the social media, and are there particular, what's the volume, the intensity, but are there specific questions that people want to put to the panel?
Okay, we've had some excellent questions come through. Interestingly enough, some of them we've already covered tonight, so that's great. So I've tried to whittle it down to sort of 4 ones which I think cover perhaps some different topics than we've already talked about. I'd just like to take this opportunity to say hello to all of you watching online, including Julia Bradbury. So I am going to start with
we do a little
Julia's
Mexican
question.
wave for Julia.
So yeah, I'll start with Julia's question. So her question was, how do we make all 4 issues more visible to the world and highlight the importance of action? As Natalie said, we can all see plastic, but perhaps what about some of the other areas that we can't see? So that's the first one. The second one from Tim is, is there a case for developing capital accounts for natural and social value next to financial for both businesses and civilians, and would that help shift paradigms? We have Rosie asking, how do we encourage governments to to responsibly tackle the issue of the housing crisis whilst reducing our impact on wildlife and habitats? Around issues of every day the greenbelt land is being sold for developers. And we have a politics-related question. How can we shift policy and actions without engaging with the fact that political and economic power is largely held by those at the top? And that's from Chris. And then finally, Megan asks, how should we be tackling and dealing with these issues in schools? And shouldn't we be trying to encourage debate on these issues from a really early age?
A great crop of questions. Thank you. Does the panel want to pick up on any one of those? Yes.
So, I just pick up on that question about environmental and social capital. And it comes back to this question of the economy and economic growth. And I would say that this problem of growth is really one of measurement and what we're trying to grow. As Simon says, basically what we're growing at the moment is how much energy and stuff we're using up, which of course is not growth, it's depletion. Because if you start looking at the social dimensions of that, and especially the environmental dimensions, you see that ecosystems are deteriorating and species are in free fall, and you see that we've got growing inequality in the world as the benefits of the economic growth are being captured by a relatively small proportion of people. This is not growth, it's the destruction of value that's going on. And I think that point about measuring growth in the quality of the environment and growth in the equality of a society, if we started measuring that, we'd have radically different outcomes. But I think we could still have growth. But what we want is growth in happiness, human well-being, and the health of ecosystems, and the cohesion of society. And if that becomes the aim of growth, then we do things completely differently. So I think that is quite a keystone thing to do, is to get different data and then start to look at whether our economic choices actually are really growing anything worthwhile or actually destroying value, which is what we're doing at the moment.
Okay. Dorothée, do you want to pick?
Julia, we need to get some more applause here, I think. So I wanted to pick up on the schools point, and so with my second hat as a trustee of Earthwatch, I think there's a lot we can do in schools and with citizens and all become citizen scientists. So Earthwatch runs a lot of programs where you get schools and citizens involved in scientific research. Because even though climate change may be a very global and intangible problem, the data gathering and the actual investigation happens very locally, and the effects are more and more locally felt with weather events, etc. So we can all get engaged, become Earth Watchers, and do our bit to collect the data that we can then use for climate change modeling, for solutions, etc.
Okay, thank you, Dora. A round of applause, please. Chair's discretion. Simon.
I'd like to meld those two concepts, the idea that we clearly don't put into any budget the catastrophic decline and destruction of natural resource. It doesn't show up on anybody's spreadsheet, and it hasn't historically, which is just mind-boggling when you think that you can show a profit based on wholesale rape of a natural resource. That aside, the people making those decisions were kids once. And if you grab people at the earliest possible stage, I don't believe there is a single human being who isn't interested and engaged in the natural world. I really don't. If you put a ladybird into the palm of a 3-year-old or any other invertebrate, it's fascinating. It may end up squashed. and in so doing provide an ambassadorial role in a life and death exercise. But you engage that kid. Somewhere along the line, that engagement disappears, and it's not helped by an environment of fear, and I mean that in the most insidious way. I have been involved in campaigns here in the UK where groups of school children have been introduced for a photo call to go pond dipping, and each and every one of them has been handed blue latex gloves before they held onto that net to go pond dipping. What is that about? It says this is dangerous, this is deadly, don't touch it. This has nothing to do with you. That is how you engender a divorce and a separation between ourselves and our life support system. So education, in the broadest possible sense, which sounds pompous, learning how we are utterly dependent on the life support system that is all around us, is fundamental and crucial. And I'm sorry to say, here in the UK, it is gently being eroded from the curriculum to the point where it's almost entirely absent. I see more in developing countries' education systems to engage groups of school children than I do here in the UK with the broad issues of how the natural world affects them. So I think we've got a lot of work to do here, and I'm looking forward to the government making sure that that happens.
Okay. And Natalie.
Next time I'm going to sit that side of Simon, so I don't always have to follow him. I think
Last word, though. That's also conclusive.
Yeah, it's good. I get to drop the mic. I think I'm going to pick up on Julia's question, actually, because that was the first one, and I forgot all the rest by the time they'd been said, which was sort of how we can make these issues more visible. And I think a lot of what I'm discovering, and as a relatively young campaigner in that sense, like new to it, not young myself, is around the stories that we're telling and the stories that we've been told and the stories that people respond to. And I think there's a lot to be said for finding creative and playful and fun ways to change the narrative. And so I think in terms of tackling all of the issues that we're looking at tonight, we have to find ways to show that actually the alternative to what we're doing at the moment, the alternative to destruction, is more fun, and it's kinder, and it's cooler. And I think that's the space that we're starting with behaviour change to learn about and to use to our advantage. But I think for all of us as ambassadors, for tonight, I have the honour of being the ambassador for the ocean, but for all of us as ambassadors for a better world, to actually be able to be the bearer of that good news and that other way, and just live that. I think that is going to make all these issues way more visible and way more fun.
I'm sorry I can't take any more questions, but now is the moment of decision, where, if you remember, we took a vote on each of those 4 environmental challenges. So we're going to vote again on those. So, are you ready? Have you thought it? Collected your thoughts? Okay, so remember, we're going to vote on 4 things, aren't we?
I'll still love you, even if you don't vote for the oceans. I still love that you're
No
all-
last minute, please, but a nice, nice touch there, Natalie. So
that baby's going to vote for.
well, we'll come to... Yeah, so very well behaved. So we're going to go, what, freshwater, then climate change, then wildlife, and then oceans, all right? So, first, freshwater. Ooh.
Slight improvement.
Yeah. Okay, so that's quite a healthy number. Okay, tackling climate change.
Of course, I could only lose.
No, still a healthy number. What do we think was more there? The climate change just ahead?
I think that was pretty even.
Pretty even, yeah. Agreed, panel? Okay. So, yes, 2 to go. 2 down, 2 to go. Wildlife. No. Wildlife, that's pretty good. Pretty good, wildlife.
We're going for a 4-way heat here.
That's what was much better than the first round, wasn't it? Yeah.
I think there were a few more hands.
Okay.
Some people put 2 hands up there.
Okay. We might have to do for another vote as well coming up now. And oceans. Okay. It's the quality that counts. It's the quality that counts. And I didn't take a question from that woman at the back there earlier. That might have made a decisive difference. Okay. So, well, anyway, we all did very well. So congratulations, panel.
Well done.
And all of these challenges are important. It's just we wanted some fun as well tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucien, for sharing us.
Thank you, Tony. And it gives me pleasure now to hand back to Steve.
Well, thank you very much, Lucien, and thank you, panel. And ladies and gentlemen, just join me, please, in one more round of applause after such a fabulous and stimulating debate. We've heard about and touched on so many important issues, too many to mention, but we all know the truth, that to overcome the challenges we face, we have to work across the board, across these topics, in an integrated fashion to help be truly sustainable by 2030. If you have not done so already, you will shortly be able to investigate firsthand some of the work that Earthwatch does in each of these critical areas in the map room, which conveniently also happens to be where the bar is. This includes some of the citizen science projects that Dorothée mentioned earlier, including on freshwater eutrophication, our groundbreaking work on coral bleaching in the Seychelles, the fantastic Capturing Our Coast, exploring coastal wildlife and how it's changing, and you can also find out about a brand new urban wildlife project, Naturehood, that Earthwatch will be launching later this year, and I urge you all, please get involved and create a Naturehood where you live. Finally, please remember that Earthwatch is a charity, and we ask that you make a small donation this evening to help us continue our work. We're currently raising funds to provide wildlife kits for inner city communities to create homes for wildlife on their doorsteps. From bug hotels to hedgehog houses, these homes can make a real difference to nature and neighbourhoods alike. We've already raised £1,000 and hope to double that tonight. So please give us a donation. The donation boxes are around the venue, or you can simply text EWUK18 followed by your chosen donation amount to 770. With that, I ask you all to please join me in the bar. Thank you very much and good night.